Welcome to Conspiracy Tapes by Skoob, where we explore the extraordinary life of one of history's most mysterious figures, Wolf Messing. I'm your host, and today we journey through the incredible story of a man who claimed to read minds, predict the future, and even cheat death itself. From a terrified child fleeing his village to becoming Stalin's most trusted psychic advisor, this is a tale that challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human consciousness. Our story begins on September 10th, 1899, near Warsaw, where a child was born who would become either history's greatest psychic or its most convincing charlatan. Wolf Messing entered this world into a poor Jewish family, but from his earliest days it was clear that this was no ordinary child. Picture an 11-year-old boy in a small Polish village watching his neighbors cross the street to avoid him. They whispered the word warlock behind their hands. Why? Because young Wolf saw things that hadn't happened yet. A neighbor's cow dying, a fire spreading through the village. And when these visions came true, fear replaced the initial mockery. His childhood was a nightmare painted in prophetic visions and violent beatings. His father, a cruel man who believed that physical punishment built spiritual strength, made home a place of terror. His mother, kind but powerless, could only watch as her sensitive son endured blow after blow. But Wolf's real curse wasn't the violence. It was the gift that made him an outcast before he even understood what it meant. One night, unable to endure another beating, 11-year-old Wolf made a decision that would change history. He ran away with nothing but the clothes on his back. No money, no plan, and nowhere to go. All he knew was that he'd rather starve on the road than suffer another day under his father's brutal hand. At the train station, desperation led to his first conscious use of what would later be called telepathic hypnosis. With no ticket to Berlin, Wolf grabbed a scrap of newspaper and handed it to the conductor, silently begging the man to see what he wanted him to see. "If you have a ticket," the conductor said calmly, "why were you hiding?" It worked. For the first time, Wolf realized his thoughts could influence another person's mind. Berlin in the early 1900s was no place for a runaway child. Thousands of boys like Wolf wandered the streets, hiding from police patrols, begging for scraps, sleeping under bridges. Hunger hollowed him out day by day, but he never turned back. Then, one night, weak and dizzy from starvation, everything went dark. When Wolf awoke, he wasn't on the street anymore. He was in a circus arena, surrounded by roaring crowds, clapping hands and stamping feet. On stage, under blinding lights, lay a pale, motionless boy. His heart didn't beat, his chest didn't rise. Yet the crowd cheered, because this was no corpse, this was a miracle. The act was called The Living Dead. What the audience didn't know was that this wasn't initially a performance. Wolf had actually died, or come so close to death that doctors in Berlin declared him gone. His body had been sent to the mortuary, and cremation preparations had begun when an attendant noticed a twitch in his hand. The doctors called it cataleptic shock, a condition where the body mimics death so perfectly that even medical professionals can be fooled. Over time, Wolf learned to control this terrifying ability. He could enter a death-like trance at will, slowing his heartbeat until it became imperceptible. 3 times a week, he would lie in a coffin for days, lifeless and still, while spectators wept, gasped, and finally applauded when his fingers stirred and his eyes opened. For each performance, he earned 5 marks a day, enough to survive and begin his journey toward legend. This was how the great Messing was born. The boy who once begged for bread had become a sensation across Europe. A man who could die and return to life, who could peer into minds and perhaps into the future itself. By 1937, Berlin glittered with Nazi confidence, and Wolf Messing had evolved from a circus curiosity into Europe's most celebrated mentalist. But on one particular day, as he walked those familiar streets with quiet pride in how far he'd come, everything changed in an instant. The city around him blurred, and before his eyes appeared a nightmare. People running, soldiers shouting, women crying. The vision was so vivid he could smell the smoke. Then it vanished, leaving him trembling and alone. 2 years later, that vision became horrifying reality. But by then, Messing had already made the most dangerous prediction of his career. In the turbulent 1930s, as Nazi power spread across Europe, Messing's fame reached the ears of Adolf Hitler himself, and what Messing said next would put a price on his head. Standing before a packed theater, Messing made a declaration that would echo through history. Hitler would meet his death if he turned toward the east, a direct reference to any invasion of Russia. The prediction was bold, specific, and utterly terrifying to Nazi leadership. An enraged Hitler placed a bounty of 200,000 marks on Messing's head, an astronomical sum that made him one of the most wanted men in Europe. The boy, who had once escaped death, understood at last what his gift truly was. Not a blessing, but a curse that had painted a target on his back. With Nazi agents hunting him across Europe, Messing faced an impossible choice: hide and hope they'd never find him, or flee to the one place Hitler's reach couldn't extend, the Soviet Union. Before we continue with Messing's escape to Russia, we must address one of the most captivating stories ever told about him: his alleged encounter with the two greatest minds of the 20th century. The legend claims that in 1915, Albert Einstein, intrigued by reports of a young telepathic prodigy, invited Messing to his home. Sigmund Freud, ever curious about the mysteries of the subconscious mind, supposedly joined them. Picture this scene: Einstein seated in his study, his violin resting nearby, Freud observing with his intense analytical gaze, and young Wolf Messing standing before them, ready to prove that human thought could be read like an open book. According to the story, Freud silently instructed Messing to take tweezers from a drawer and pull out 3 hairs from Freud's mustache. Without a single word being exchanged, Messing supposedly carried out this bizarre task precisely, leaving both intellectual giants astonished. It's a beautiful tale, one that perfectly captures our desire to believe that even the greatest rational minds could be humbled by the unexplainable. The image of Einstein, the symbol of pure reason, and Freud, the explorer of the human psyche, witnessing something that defied all their understanding, is irresistibly romantic. But here's where legend collides with reality. Historical records show no evidence of such a meeting. Einstein and Freud didn't even meet each other until 1930, years after this supposed encounter. No letters, diaries, or documentation place Messing anywhere near either man during the claimed time frame. Why did this myth arise and endure? Perhaps because it expressed something people desperately wanted to believe: that science and mysticism could coexist, that logic and intuition were partners rather than enemies in the search for truth. When asked about the encounter later in life, Messing would only smile mysteriously and say, "I have met many minds, but few hearts." His silence allowed the story to live on, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Fleeing Nazi persecution, Messing escaped to the Soviet Union, where he encountered a leader perhaps even more dangerous than Hitler, Joseph Stalin. In a regime that had outlawed religion and denounced mysticism as superstitious nonsense, how did a Jewish psychic not only survive but thrive? The answer lies in one of the most extraordinary stories in the annals of psychic phenomena. Stalin, notorious for his paranoia and suspicion, was nonetheless pragmatic about talent that might serve state interests. When Messing was brought before him, the dictator decided to test these alleged abilities in the most dramatic way possible. Stalin's challenge was audacious. Rob a Moscow bank using only your psychic powers. What happened next has become legend throughout Russia. Messing entered a state bank carrying an empty attaché case. He approached a cashier and handed him a blank piece of paper. With intense mental focus, what he called telepathic hypnosis, Messing silently commanded the clerk to fill his case with 100,000 rubles. The impossible happened. The cashier, seeing whatever Messing willed him to see, calmly filled the case with money despite the paper being completely blank. When Messing later returned the blank paper instead of any receipt, the cashier reportedly suffered a heart attack, overwhelmed by the inexplicable experience. This incident convinced Stalin that Messing was far more than an entertainer. The dictator saw in him a unique tool, someone whose abilities might serve the secretive needs of the state. Their relationship was complex. Stalin was fascinated by Messing's powers, but never forgot that in his regime, even the most gifted individuals lived under constant scrutiny and threat. That Messing not only survived but flourished under Stalin speaks to his skill as both a psychic and a careful navigator of one of history's most volatile courts. The man who could allegedly read minds had to use every ounce of that ability to stay alive in a world where paranoia was a survival skill. But Messing's most stunning demonstration of his alleged abilities was yet to come. On March 7, 1944, before a packed audience in Moscow, he made what would become his most famous prediction. With the war still raging and Hitler's fate uncertain, Messing announced not just that Germany would lose, but the exact date of Hitler's death and Nazi surrender. His words were recorded, witnessed by hundreds, and filed away by Soviet authorities who had learned to take his predictions seriously. When his forecasts proved accurate to the day, Messing's reputation as a genuine prophet was cemented throughout the Soviet Union. How do we explain such precision? Messing himself described his ability as telepathic hypnosis, a state where he could project his will into others or receive their mental images. He said people's thoughts appeared to him not as words, but as vivid, colorful pictures that played like movies in his mind. When possible, he preferred physical contact, touching a person's hand to establish what he called a stronger psychic connection. After the war, Messing became a celebrated stage performer, blending hypnosis, suggestion, and his claimed intuitive abilities into mesmerizing acts that filled theaters across the Soviet Union. Russian scientists and neurologists, intrigued despite their materialist worldview, attempted to study him. But Messing often refused detailed examination, perhaps understanding that mystery was more powerful than explanation. One neurologist did claim that certain parts of Messing's skull emitted unusual amounts of heat during mental exertion, though no clear explanation was ever found. Some researchers later proposed that his talents might have resulted from extreme sensitivity to subtle muscular cues and subconscious signals, a psychological rather than paranormal skill. What's particularly fascinating is how Messing's story intersects with a hidden chapter of Cold War history. While publicly dismissing psychic phenomena as superstition, governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain were secretly investing millions in paranormal research. The Soviets poured the equivalent of $21 million into experiments on telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. Telepathic communication even found its way into their space program. During World War I, the Czech army had experimented with telepathy to locate enemy positions. By 1925, they published a manual claiming telepathic communication was 98% reliable, more dependable than their radios. Across the Atlantic, U.S. intelligence agencies invested heavily in remote viewing programs, training operatives to perceive distant targets and locate military installations through psychic means. The irony was almost unbearable. While Helen Duncan, a British medium, was prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act for allegedly revealing military secrets through supernatural means, those same governments were trying to weaponize psychic abilities. This parallel development suggests that whatever Messing possessed, whether genuine psychic ability or extraordinary psychological insight, was taken seriously by the most powerful people on Earth. In a world where the supernatural was officially forbidden, Wolf Messing walked the corridors of power, influencing events in ways that defied easy explanation. In his later years, Messing began sharing insights that went far beyond predictions and mind reading. He spoke about death, the afterlife, and the nature of consciousness itself, topics that made even his supporters uncomfortable. What he revealed was so unsettling that recordings of his speeches mysteriously disappeared, and those present were reluctant to speak about what they'd heard. According to witnesses, Messing described death not as an ending, but as a transition. He claimed that souls linger for 3 days after bodily death, wandering and observing who cries, who rejoices, who remembers, and who has already forgotten. Then comes what he called the judgment of the soul by itself. Not divine punishment, but a complete re-experiencing of one's life through the eyes of everyone they had affected. Most shocking of all, he suggested that some souls choose to return. Not reincarnation, but as invisible guardians watching over the living. In this hall, he once told a stunned audience, 10 people are being watched by someone, not with malice, but with hope. They are waiting for you to take a step, to choose a path. Several audience members later claimed that night changed their lives completely. One abandoned his business to work as a volunteer. Another reconciled with his mother after 20 years of silence. All swore they felt something whisper inside them, as if a voice had risen from their own hearts. Why were these teachings considered so dangerous? Perhaps because they suggested a universe far more connected and mysterious than official doctrine allowed. In a materialist state that had outlawed spiritual belief, Messing was describing bridges between worlds, invisible connections between the living and the dead. Wolf Messing died in 1974, taking his secrets with him. His nurse remembered that in his final moments he seemed to be speaking to someone invisible, smiling faintly as if reunited with a long-lost friend. Looking toward an empty corner of the room, he said only, "Now, you see how simple it is," and fell still. What are we to make of Wolf Messing? Was he history's greatest psychic, a master showman, or something in between? The evidence is as contradictory as the man himself. Some of his predictions were startlingly accurate. Others failed completely. Some of his demonstrations seem impossible to explain. Others could have been elaborate tricks. Perhaps the answer lies not in proving or disproving his abilities, but in understanding what his story represents. In an age that divided reality into the measurable and the mythical, Messing existed in the space between, where consciousness touches the unknown, where human potential exceeds our understanding. Modern research into consciousness, quantum physics, and the nature of reality continues to reveal phenomena that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. Remote viewing programs, once classified, have been partially declassified, revealing serious scientific attempts to understand abilities that sound remarkably like what Messing claimed to possess. Whether Wolf Messing was truly psychic or simply an extraordinary student of human nature, his story reminds us that the universe remains full of mysteries. In a world increasingly explained by science, his legacy poses uncomfortable questions. What if consciousness is more than just brain activity? What if the boundaries between minds are more porous than we believe? What if death is not the end, but a doorway? Here's a tightened rewrite within your requested range. Wolf Messing's legend endures decades after his death, a figure balanced between science and the supernatural, belief and illusion. To some, he proved psychic ability. To others, he revealed the persuasive power of performance and faith. Yet his real legacy may be simpler, reminding us that reality is often stranger than certainty allows. From a runaway boy in a Polish village to an advisor in Soviet halls of power, his life reads like myth and still refuses a final explanation. But what if the most unsettling details of his story were never fully told? What if the mystery surrounding his mind goes deeper than history records? Download Skoob now to uncover the full story and explore the questions left unanswered. Because some mysteries are only just beginning to unfold,